So thanks everyone for joining us for today's event, revisiting the Irving S. Gilmore Music Library's CD-ROM collection. I'm gonna start the event with a little bit of housekeeping. Please make sure your microphone is muted to prevent audio interruptions. Feel free to leave your camera off, or if your camera's on, be mindful of your Zoom background. We'll have hopefully some time for Q&A at the end of today's event. So we're looking forward to hearing your questions. Feel free to put those in the chat as we go along. This event is brought to you by the Yale Born Digital Archives Advisory Group, also known as BDAG. BDAG aims to facilitate a community of practice across Yale libraries and museums to develop skills, share solutions, and grow a network of users and practitioners acquiring, managing, preserving, and providing access to Born Digital archival materials. We are recording this event, and the recording will be shared with all of the meeting registrants. For those of us who are, for those in the meeting who are part of the Yale community, if you'd like to be part of our Born Digital community of practice, you can join us on our Teams channel. And yeah, I think that's most of the introductory material. We'll have 3 presenters today, followed by hopefully plenty of time for Q&A. Our presenters are Suzanne Lovejoy, Music Librarian for Access and Research Services at the Irving S. Gilmore Music Library. Myself, Eric Sonnenberg, Digital Archivist at the Music Library, and Claire Fox, Software Preservation and Emulation Librarian and in Preservation and Conservation Services. So to get started, I'll hand it over to Suzanne to introduce the CD-ROM collection.
I'll jump in quickly first with some context for what CD-ROMs are. Just to establish some shared context, there's a lot of different optical media formats out there that I'm sure that many of you on this call are well aware of or have used in your life for varying purposes. But for today, Eric, you can go to the next slide. So for our purposes today, CD-ROMs are commercially published read-only disk format to store different types of data that are generally used to distribute music and software. So this format was introduced in the mid-1980s, and it eventually replaced the floppy disk as the primary method of data distribution out there. And it was in active use through the 2000s and declined with the use of DVDs, hard drives, and the internet. Today it faces issues with degradation and obsolescence. So degradation here referring to the physical and chemical breakdown of the disk, whether it's through use and things like physical scratches or the chemical deterioration of the disk over time. And then obsolescence referring to the evolution of technology to newer formats, which can sometimes trap content into previous legacy generations of formats. So even here in the case of CD-ROMs, which are not necessarily completely obsolete, but there's still content that is difficult to access as a result of obsolescence. So today for us, the obsolescence challenge is how can librarians and archivists support patron use of these materials on CD-ROMs for research today? And today's presentation aims to build some context about how we might better understand these materials to build a reasonable preservation and access plan for our patrons. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Suzanne.
Thank you, Claire. Next slide, please, Eric. So why did we collect these CD-ROMs in the first place? I think the main reason was that we believed they would help support students' work at Yale, possibly faculty and other researchers too. CD-ROMs represented new, innovative ways of publishing information. They were often multimedia formats, and some were interactive. And so this was something that hadn't been available before. They were much less expensive to produce than traditional print formats. And I think it's safe to say that a lot of these, the things published on these CDs would never have seen the light of day if they'd had to be printed in book format along with an accompanying CD. And a number of them came to us because they were accompanying material for printed books or printed scores. Next slide. So what are they? This is the beginning of an overview of the kinds of CD-ROMs in the collection. A number of them contain sound samples or sound effects. Sound samples are used by composers in creating new compositions. And one example of these is a poke in the ear with a sharp stick, which makes my skin crawl every time I read the title. The publisher said it was not a normal sound sample library, but it was intended to push musicality in new directions. So I think a lot of the sounds are computer generated sounds that might not have been heard before. And it was also interesting, they, in puffing the CD-ROM, that their website is still active. Who's been using some of these sounds? And they include current composers you'll recognize from various performing groups. And they have also appeared in television and film soundtracks. The publisher's website is still active, and you can buy some of these sounds nowadays on download or even on CD-ROM. And other sounds categories included instruments and singing from different parts of the world, such as Asia, Africa, and Australia, as well as sounds of Western classical instruments for insertion in whatever. And then there are sound effects. These are intended to reinforce or enhance digital actions, such as the Warner Brothers sound effects library. And I'm sure you can hear Woody the Woodpecker right now, hammering away at that tree. And some of these sound CD-ROMs have to be used with proprietary sampling devices. Next slide. A large group of these CDs were interested in contextualizing musical works. So Robert Winter's Crazy for Ragtime had 60 recordings of rags, a bunch of sheet music covers, and because they are early 20th century covers, they were very colorful and had interesting illustrations. Also rare film footage of cakewalk dancing, not so rare today probably, but at the time it would have been, and 250 articles on American life during the ragtime era, which is roughly 1900 to 1920. Another typical, also produced by Robert Winter, was Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And the description indicates that it had a complete recording of the symphony, a single screen overview with links to the major sections, a measure by measure running commentary, musical illustrations of concepts, an examination of the composer's life and times, and a Jeopardy style musical game. Next slide. And we have a dozen or so works that were on the Voyager platform or published by Voyager. Others contextualize biography and history, Paul Hindemith's life and work, or the music of the Baroque, which had a book and the CD-ROM. And this is Paul Hindemith himself teaching here at Yale from our collections. Next slide. A large group included digitized manuscripts and archival documents. So these would have taken a lot of space, I guess, at the time. One, Gaetano Donizetti's opera score of Lucia di Lammermoor covers 2 discs. And there's another set, Studien zur Musikarchäologie, which has been published over 2 decades. It's now 12 volumes with 9 CD-ROMs and 1 audio CD. Next slide. Oh, digitized orchestral parts. These were really important when they came out because music libraries do not generally collect orchestral parts. At Yale, for example, we collect the parts for chamber music, and a part is what you would hand out to an individual musician in an ensemble. And so it's just showing the music for that instrument, as opposed to the score, which would show all of the instruments one over the other. So part is much easier for an instrumentalist to read, and because they were not collected by libraries, if they weren't in the musician's own orchestra library, they really didn't have a way to access them usually without going through some kind of special collections route. We have about 11 collections. I've listed 4 of them here. And as you can see, a number of works in each title, and then a number of discs as well. So for example, some of them might have 14 different discs devoted to the different instruments. Next slide. Then there are more traditional types of publication that used to come out in print, but now it's easier to distribute in CD-ROM. So bibliography is a big category. The third title here is now actually part of an electronic database that we subscribe to. But the first time it came out, it was updating a print set of, a dozen or so volumes, and yet because the RISM project is attempting to document primary sources of music in libraries and collections around the world. And this particular part of the series, the single prints devoted to one composer, already had been out in 14 volumes. So then they added a CD-ROM, and now it's an electronic database. And that way, as libraries submit new titles or holdings to the project, they can keep it up to date. Next slide. And then there are other types of things that pretty much anything you could find in print, you could also find in CD-ROM or a CD-ROM adjunct to it. Next slide. The next thing I looked at was the circulation of these discs. So our collection includes 638 titles. And I found that the titles that circulated the most, the top 25, were almost entirely sound samples and sound effects. So for a time, these were very heavily used by members of our community. They had 30 to 67 circulations per title. But the last one happened in 2011. Next slide. So what's still circulating? This became a little more complicated and not as easy to describe succinctly. I looked, 10 titles have circulated since 2020, so in this decade. Most recently, the North German Organ Research Project at Göteborg University, which came with a book and includes documentation of historical material of organs from the Baroque in North Germany and audio examples. A group of them are what I would call music theory kinds of texts, sight singing, sort of skills that music students learn as they enter college. Horn solos, again, someone wanting to play the important orchestral horn solos. Gradual psalms, so there are apparently a lot of these. These are all PDF files, and the use was intended for congregations. One is a photocopy of a score, which was sent to us from the Bibliothèque Nationale. Interesting, that might be a CDR. Again, probably PDFs. Two DVD ROMs that are crept into this collection introduce the rhythms of South Indian music. So, and there's also a book. And then an archival collection, 102 sonatas for violin and keyboard instrument from the Minoriten Convent in Vienna. Let's see, next slide. So the kinds of questions I had after reviewing the content was, one, how many of these have been replaced by online resources, either a subscription database or maybe a free site like the IMSLP, the International Scores Music Library Project, which is also known as Petrucci, I think. And that's a place where public domain scores from around the world have been collected and point to what the institutions that put them online is the CD-ROM format still the only format that has this material available? Or does it represent an art form at a particular point in time that, you know, you want it in the way it was originally distributed? And then finally, is the experience worth recreating? So I'll turn it over to you, Eric.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about current usage and what the experience is of using these materials today, or attempting to use them. As Suzanne mentioned, these materials are still requested occasionally. It seems like roughly a couple times a year, maybe a few times a year. We recently purchased a couple of external hard drives for patrons to check out because nobody has this kind of a drive on their laptop anymore. The workstations here at the library, I think, mostly don't have them either. Those I think are mostly used maybe for audio CDs, but also for these. But we've received minimal feedback from patrons on what their experience has been using these CD-ROMs in recent years. So I wanted to kind of take a survey of the collection, try some of these out and see, are they usable? How easy are they to use on kind of current operating systems and software of today? The call number contains 413 items, which I realize is a little different from the number Suzanne got. I think there are duplicates of some maybe, and that's the difference. They're published from the earliest ones date to around 1988, sometime in the late 80s. And the most recently published CD-ROM we have was published in 2022, which was a little surprising to me that we had something published that recently. So I sampled a range of CD-ROMs across all of the different dates, operating systems, kind of types of content, and the different levels of interactivity that were intended for each disk to see how they worked. And there was a whole range of results I got. And I'll kind of go through them in order of how well they worked. A number of disks simply were completely non-functional. The samples and sound effects CD-ROMs that Suzanne mentioned mostly would not load at all. There was no way to access the information on them. These represent many of the oldest materials in the collection and were designed for use with the hardware or software sampler. A lot of them were designed for the Sample Cell 2 card, which was a card you would install in your Macintosh computer that could allow you to connect to a kind of MIDI controller like a keyboard and activate these samples. These were really heavily used and I think still have the most circulation total of any of the materials in this collection, but mostly have not been used since the early aughts and don't even load at all. So this is an example of Hanna-Barbera sound effects, kind of cartoon sound effects CD-ROM. This is the one of the Poke in the Ear with the Sharp Stick collection CD-ROMs, and when you try to play them, it's simply not readable. It won't mount the drive at all. So there is possibly a way to get at this material, but it's definitely not an easily accessible for the average user. Most of the materials I looked at, though, fell in the realm of kind of partial functionality. Some parts worked and some don't. In this category, a lot of the interactive scores and parts, the database materials, the sort of interactive music history and biography materials, basically anything. Many of these materials have a set of audiovisual or textual files wrapped in an interactive software kind of front end that allows you to navigate through all of the materials. And often the audiovisual materials are still visible and accessible through the file browser, but the software no longer works, can't be installed on a current computer. So this is an example of one of the Robert Winter CDs that Suzanne mentioned. This is a Rite of Spring, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, and you can see at the top of the cover there a little bit of what the software is supposed to look like, showing you some historical information or score information, and that's not available anymore. But if you put it into a current day Mac, it will load as an audio CD. It will come up and ask if you want to import the CD to your drive. It has all the metadata there, and you can play the audio files, including the recorded descriptions and explanations that Professor Winter created for all of these. But rather than being connected, I think it said maybe measure by measure descriptions, it's one long 37-minute audio file with all of those things. So it's accessible to some extent, but is lacking a ton of the context that it originally came with. And this setup was common to a lot of these, a lot of this type of CD-ROM. On Windows, it often looks like this. There's a start.exe file, which is supposed to load the software, and it simply can't run on a current PC. But you can navigate through the folder structure and access some of the materials. This is a movie of the composer Paul Hindemith, I mentioned earlier, conducting. This is another one that includes a demo, actually, of the software itself, which I thought was interesting because it shows a little bit of how it was intended to be used. This is a woman, and she's got it's an interactive score. So the score would display on the computer, a MIDI keyboard is connected, and you could play in sync with instruments being played through the computer while the score rolls. And so it shows a little bit of how many of these depended on a lot of external software and equipment for sort of the full effect of what they were intended to do. Another example would be some of these archival scanned scores and materials. This originally had a software browser that would allow you to go through these and browse through the materials. That no longer works, but you can browse through a folder and still open and access the materials, if a little bit less simply and easily. And then there are still a lot of discs that still work perfectly well. The newer scores and recordings, these make up a lot of our more recent acquisitions in maybe the last 10 years or so. This one that's pictured is from 2018. A lot of these accompany a printed score, so maybe we acquired a physical score and it comes with a CD-ROM, which has PDF parts for individual instruments and maybe audio recordings of the piece for reference for someone wanting to perform it. So this is an example of what that might look like. These newer discs have sort of for the most part, I think, no longer try to create an interactive environment in the same way that the old ones do. They mostly just rely on a well-named folder structure and well-named files, and you navigate it through a file browser, as you can see here, to pull up scores, audio files, or whatever else is included. Some materials that still work well are those which use kind of third-party software as their interface. This is a newer one, but I know there are older ones that go back to the 90s that use Adobe Acrobat as the interface, essentially. So this is the front page of when you put the CD-ROM in, but it is just a PDF with links. Each of those boxes links out to another PDF, and you navigate around between different PDFs, and the interface is entirely within Acrobat Reader. And so even with older ones like this, it still works because that's a fairly backwards compatible technology that isn't some kind of bespoke software that was created for the individual CD. And then some of the interactive things do still work. This is a CD-ROM from 1998 of Cuban popular music history. And you can see on the right, it installs and loads just fine in Windows in a very small window because it's expecting a much lower resolution screen. But it loads. This is what the original interface would have looked like with this, I guess, Havana street corner. And there's different doors that you can enter to watch videos, play music. The music room has a jukebox, and you can navigate through and select different artists, different genres, play music, read historical information and biographical information. So some of these more interactive ones do still work, but the bulk of them have something that won't play on a newer computer, and who knows how long this will continue to function. So my takeaways from kind of the survey was just kind of the wide range of accessibility that's available on current hardware, and the fact that I think most of the materials that I tried to use had something that wasn't working anymore, even if they were partly accessible in some way and maybe usefully accessible. There was some aspect of it that no longer functioned as it was intended. And the other thing that struck me was how many of these disks are dependent on some outside software or hardware, like the disks that use Adobe Acrobat, or the hardware samplers. Some of them also those dating from the mid-90s on, sometimes had internet aspects. They might have updated software, or you could get updated information or additional audiovisual files at an internet link that probably does not exist or work anymore. And so that was something that I found interesting, that it many of these have a lot of dependencies outside the disk itself and are not sort of fully self-sufficient in a way. So questions for access in the future that I kind of came up with that in some ways mirror Suzanne's, thinking about, is content available elsewhere or in another format? Is partial or less interactive access sufficient for patron needs? For some of these, it might be. If there's an interview with a composer on a CD-ROM, and that's findable through the file browser, that might be sufficient to meet a patron's needs, even if they can't access it through the original interactive software that was the original intention. When to think about long-term preservation and backup as the physical format becomes fragile or older and harder to navigate and may start to fail. And then finally, when does emulation become the best or the only, in some cases, option for accessing these in the way that they were intended? And so with that, I will hand it over to Claire.
This is really fun. We've been meeting to meet to get this meeting together, get this event together for the past few weeks, and this is sort of our first chance that we've had to present our findings to each other. So it's just really great to be able to hear from Suzanne and Eric in this venue. So next slide. This one, yes, thank you. So my name is Claire Fox. I am the software preservation and emulation librarian at Yale. And in the case of the CD-ROMs for this collection, I'm able to take a closer look at the technical requirements for these materials and collaborate with colleagues like Suzanne and Eric to find a preservation and access solution that works for us, which is essentially what we're doing with this event. So my work is part of the software preservation and emulation unit at Yale Library. Our mission is that we use software preservation and emulation to preserve and expand access to digital collections that advance teaching, research, learning, creativity, and practice. In short, the way that I think about this is that we build infrastructure to support software-dependent collection materials that have become inaccessible due to cycles of obsolescence. So Eric, if you wouldn't mind dropping in that LibGuide link, that'd be awesome, to the chat. So in the software preservation and emulation unit, emulation is, of course, our central strategy for supporting collections like these. So when we use emulation as a strategy at Yale, we're using software applications that are called emulators, which mimic or emulate legacy computer hardware and allow us to then make use of obsolete software to support software-dependent collection materials. CD-ROMs are a really great example, as we've seen, of software-dependent collections. They're often dependent on software and hardware components that make up older computers in order to be accessed and interacted with. So you can catch a glimpse of these dependencies in this advertisement in the slide for CD-ROM packages in a 1993 issue of Yale Daily News. My favorite note here, which you cannot read at all, but it's the third text block down on the left-hand side. I'll read it for you. It says, CD-ROM technology brings vast new capabilities to the desktop, which is why soon more and more computers will include a CD-ROM drive. Buy one and you're making an investment that will last you well into the future. So of course, here we are in the future. It's been 30 years. I don't have a CD-ROM drive in my computer. They tend to be very uncommon now. And speaking from experience, I even have a difficult time using an external optical drive and connecting that to my M3 MacBook. And that said, if anybody does have an optical drive in their computer, I encourage you to share that in the chat. So next slide, please. So let's talk about some preliminary steps, then specifically steps that I take to get a sense of how we can plan for preservation and access to CD-ROMs using emulation. So when I start planning for emulation, I look for information about hardware dependencies and software dependencies, so I can later use that information to source software and then select an emulator to create an emulated computing environment. There's a lot to unpack in that sentence, and so we'll get into a little bit of that today, but we'll mostly just focus on information gathering. So I'll use Laurie Anderson's 1995 multimedia CD-ROM called Puppet Motel as an example. This is a title that's within the CD-ROM collection in the music library, and this one in the image happens to be my own copy. So the materials that are dependent, these materials are dependent on legacy software and hardware for access. And so I know this, like Eric has demonstrated, as soon as I plug in my optical drive and try to mount the CD-ROM across different operating systems that are on contemporary computers, they all throw error messages that say the disk is unreadable. I can also just know this by looking at the software packaging to a certain extent. In the image in the upper right-hand corner, you can sort of read that there's a list of technical requirements that includes a Power Macintosh, which is from a family of personal computers sold by Apple from 1994 to 2006, and System 7, which is an operating system that had its first release in 1991 and latest release in 1997. So even though these requirements are specific and they were like slightly advanced for their time, they're also pretty standard. I expect that this will be the case for a lot of the CD-ROMs in our collection, although Eric was just describing all these external dependencies, so it like adds some nice complexity there. But you know, when we're thinking about dependencies, there's also another source that we can use to compare to packaging, or if packaging is not available, we can look to the Yale Library catalog. And there's information there that can help us out. So I'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So on this slide, you can see a screen grab of the catalog record for Puppet Motel in Quick Search, which is the Yale Library catalog. And Eric, if you can drop a link to the record in the chat, that'd be awesome. Thank you. And so I'm also just wondering if someone on this call created this record. And if you did, thank you. But our catalog records are very thorough. I'm especially appreciative of the work that our catalogers did with MARC Field 538, which is a system details note. This work that Yale Library catalogers did in the early aughts provided great support for me and for other librarians in these 20 plus years later by adding system details to the record. The information might not look useful, and I know it's very tiny, but this information might not look very useful at first glance. And I wouldn't imagine that this was particularly fun information to gather and type in this field, but today it's really helping me get started with preservation planning. So let's go to the next slide. So zooming in on the details a little bit, it's still text to read, but on the top, there's an image that I shared previously of the technical requirements listed in Puppet Motel's guide. On the bottom, there is a MARC specific view of the catalog record, which you can also like all access in that catalog record that Eric linked. And that's of the information in field 538. So as you can see, the information in 538 closely resembles what was listed in the packaging, and the additional information comes from elsewhere in the packaging. This particular cataloger did a great job of like summarizing information that was available in several different places. So the key information that gets me started here is that operating system information. So operating systems are key software components that perform basic functions for computers, and they are indicative of hardware needs and serve as the foundation for software dependency management in our work. So if I'm doing this introductory emulation planning, gathering information about operating systems is the place that at least I'm going to go to start that planning process. So next slide, please. So zooming out from Puppet Motel, I want to get a sense of what the main operating systems are that support content on the CD-ROMs kind of like at large in the music library. So it's helpful for me to take a look at all of the CD-ROM records together and do a basic assessment of which operating systems are listed in that 538 field. And the way that I approached this was to just export all of the text records from the catalog with the CDRM call number and the music library location, and then shape that information into a spreadsheet, which I then took a look at in OpenRefine, which is a really helpful data cleaning tool that I am new to. But as it goes with library free text catalog fields, the data available in this field is like somewhat consistent. There's not a controlled vocabulary that is used to describe system requirements, at least not one that I'm aware of. But what that means is that this information just requires a little bit of finessing to parse. And you can kind of see my attempts at this by like, you know, looking at these different detect OS fields that I have here that are pulling from that field on the far left, which is all of those system requirements in the 538 field. So next slide. So these, this is like kind of a vague results slide, but just this is like based on an introductory pass at the data, but here's what I can tell from this preliminary perspective. So first, of the 413 items that are in this music library location CDRM call number, 150 titles have the field 538, which is about 36%, which is not bad. And so then on the right, there's a list that's like an estimate of all of the operating systems that appear across these 150 titles. There's a number of these titles that list multiple operating systems, so there's some flexibility here, and this range represents, kind of an expected list, I think, of operating systems from across the era that they were published. But what this can do for me is I can start to make decisions in a few different ways. And one is just to consider, again, like which operating systems appear the most frequently. So this is like a ballpark estimate, but looking at like Windows 3.1, Windows 95, Windows XP, and System 7, this kind of gives me a direction that I can go in to be like, which items or which operating systems do I want to make sure that I have available so I can start to build emulated computing environments. So yeah, next slide. So important question, what can we support at Yale right now and what can other institutions support as well? At Yale, we're lucky that we can support most of these operating systems that are on that longer list. There's of course some history here. Yale is the development headquarters for Emulation as a Service infrastructure, which is also known by its acronym EASY. EASY began as a grant-funded project supported by the Mellon and Sloan Foundations, and the research we conducted during that time resulted in bringing in a number of different operating systems and other software applications for research. Ethan's noting a gap, so we have another direction to go in there too. And Eric, if you could drop the link for the EASY Research Alliance, if folks want to learn more about the kind of work that we're doing in collaboration with other institutions, please check out that link that's in the chat. Thanks, Eric. So I mean, that said, we of course can always acquire more software titles, and we know that many other institutions would also need to acquire more software titles in order to provide access to CD-ROMs in their collections. And this raises the question of how you actually acquire legacy software titles, whether they're operating systems or software applications or plugins or external dependencies, what have you. So I don't think that there's a straightforward answer to this question. Practitioners tend to think very creatively about this. So it might be like seeking donations, going to estate sales, keeping an eye on eBay. That's the image that's in this slide, just some available System 7 disks that are on eBay right now. But it's worth noting that none of these options are particularly stable. So we're still continuing to, think creatively there. So next slide. So in terms of thinking about what this sort of preliminary evaluation work enables, I think that the thing that it does for us is it gives us a starting point. If we know what software we need, we can start to consider what our budget might be to acquire software, also what kind of staff time we need to devote to sourcing or just setting up emulated computing environments. We can also think about what kinds of skills we need to do this work and whether we'll need to devote time to learning those skills and potentially teaching them to others who might support this work. We can also estimate how long this work might take by doing something like starting up a task force. We can also make plans to share this information with other institutions. We've had a lot of time and resources to devote to doing this type of work at Yale, and we want to share what we've learned with other institutions that might benefit from this knowledge. So the screen grab on this slide is a record for Puppet Motel and WorldCat, which indicates that this title is held by 69 other libraries or 68 other libraries. And Eric, if there's one more link, I think just for that WorldCat record. I think that this title is pretty popular, but at the same time, there's, for many of the titles that we hold in the music library, they're commercially published materials. I imagine that many other libraries hold those materials as well, at least in some cases. And so those institutions might be wondering how they can make similar materials accessible. And so it's worth noting, I think, that this applies to CD-ROMs, but it's also directly related to dependency management, like software dependency management challenges that we face in other types of collections. So like legacy websites or databases, digital humanities projects, all of that. Software dependency work is one of those things that feels like it shouldn't be difficult or time consuming, but the fact is that it is. And in software preservation and emulation as a unit, we're working on breaking down that problem into manageable steps so we can figure out how to do this in a sustainable way. And it makes me, I mean, as a practitioner, starting from the data that's in the catalog records makes me feel very happy because it means that I can leverage the work that was done by my Yale colleagues 20 or 30 years ago. And it also makes me feel like the work that we're doing today might support somebody else in the future too. So next slide. So what else informs our next steps? So it's not all technical metadata. There's the actual content that's on the CD-ROMs and the curators and selectors' knowledge of that content. So it's really great to hear from Suzanne and Eric again today, just to know more about what's on the CD-ROMs and how we think about it. I can always aim to get rolling with thinking about building out environments for everything supported by Windows 95, but we might also think about content specific parameters like all of the multimedia CD-ROMs or all CD-ROMs that feature women artists like Laurie Anderson, or all CD-ROMs that were published by Voyager or something else like that. This work might also be informed by usage data or patron experiences where there's known patron interest like we've been discussing. And this might mean that we really get into digging into those message boards and figuring out how to provide access to those samples on the CD-ROMs. But however we choose to prioritize this work, the aim is to remove technical barriers for access wherever we can. So even though the format is approaching obsolescence, it doesn't mean that the content itself is obsolete. And it's exciting to consider what types of research we can enable if we make these materials accessible to patrons. Next slide. And I think that's it from us for the presentation. And so we have over 80 people here in this meeting, but we're here for questions.